¿Cómo están? Muy buenas tardes. Soy Nicolás Alvarado, coordinador del Coloquio Anual de Muro a Muro de FIL Guadalajara, que llega aquí a su cuarta edición. Es un foro que está dedicado a pensar los nuevos paradigmas. Vivimos en un mundo en una transformación vertiginosa en términos sociales, políticos, económicos y culturales, a partir de una serie de factores que se han presentado en los últimos tiempos: un auge de los autoritarismos, una puesta en crisis de la democracia liberal, una problematización del modelo económico, una problematización de la idea de género y de sexo, y en esas estábamos cuando de pronto llega la pandemia. Por eso, de Muro a Muro está dedicado este año a lo que hemos denominado el nuevo desorden postviral. A lo largo de 4 sesiones en FIL Guadalajara, hoy y mañana, 28 y 29 de noviembre, estaremos hablando con intelectuales de primera línea de todo el mundo, con pensadores como Jacques Attali, como Mohamed El Baradei, como Hartmut Rosa, como Sergio Benvenuto, como tantos otros, como los dos que nos acompañan hoy, para tratar de entender hacia dónde vamos, qué va a resultar, para especular, para imaginar, para analizar qué va a resultar de esta puesta en crisis de nuestros hábitos sociales, de nuestras formas culturales, de nuestro modelo económico, de la geopolítica misma a partir de la pandemia. Esta es la primera sesión de Muro a Muro y está dedicada a el virus como metáfora. Uno de los principales autores que consultamos para la configuración de esta edición de Muro a Muro fue Ian Buruma, extraordinario escritor, ensayista, editor, también extraordinario defensor y teórico de los derechos humanos. Y la lectura de Buruma nos puso en alerta, como otras lecturas, a la idea del virus como un fenómeno, digamos, que trasciende el COVID-19 y que está presente en las sociedades, la idea de la viralidad en términos políticos, en términos comunicacionales, en términos sociales, y por eso quisimos explorar esta idea hoy. Nos acompaña también un interlocutor de larga data, no solo de Ian Buruma, sino de FIL Guadalajara, Enrique Krauze. Nos honra muchísimo que la visita anual de Enrique Krauze a FIL Guadalajara este año haya sido por esta vía, por de Muro a Muro, y se me antoja mucho este intercambio, no necesariamente armónico, y eso se me antoja más, que vamos a ver a lo largo de la próxima hora entre Ian Buruma y Enrique Krauze. Y nos acompaña Paloma Vargas, académica de la Escuela de Humanidades del Tecnológico de Monterrey, porque a partir de este año, de Muro a Muro es una iniciativa conjunta de 2 ferias del libro y de 2 universidades, de FIL Guadalajara y de FIL Monterrey, de la Universidad de Guadalajara y del Tecnológico de Monterrey. Ya tuvieron la oportunidad de ver a Paloma en las sesiones de Muro a Muro en FIL Monterrey, en una mesa espléndida justamente sobre este tema, sobre el virus como metáfora, en donde Paloma hizo una extraordinaria labor, y nos honra mucho que esté aquí en representación de una institución con la que creo que tendremos mucho que construir, la Universidad de Guadalajara y FIL Guadalajara, el TEC de Monterrey y FIL Monterrey. Muchísimas gracias a Ana Laura Santamaría y a todo el equipo del Instituto Tecnológico de Monterrey por todos sus buenos oficios para que esta iniciativa reúna ambas universidades. Y esto también está viéndose a partir de hoy, a partir de esta edición de Muro a Muro, en Latinos, el portal de noticias. Agradezco enormemente a Carlos Loret de Mola que haya hecho suyo Latinos de Muro a Muro también a partir de esta edición y que podamos tener una alianza con ellos. Y bueno, dejo de dar lata, de hecho yo ya me voy a tomar mi lugar virtual entre el público para ver esta extraordinaria charla que sigue con Buruma y Enrique Krauze, moderados y espero que inmoderados y acicateados por Paloma Vargas. Te dejo la palabra, Paloma. Muchísimas gracias a los tres por estar aquí y gracias a ustedes por acompañarnos.
Muchísimas gracias, Nicolás. Es para mí un gusto enorme poder compartir este espacio. Antiguos nahuas de los tiempos prehispánicos concibían la enfermedad como el miedo como parte de la enfermedad. En el Códice Florentino, compilado por Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, se registra cómo el tonali era entendido como una fuerza vital de los seres humanos. Para que los humanos estuvieran sanos, el cuerpo y el tonali debían de estar en equilibrio. El miedo, los celos, la rabia y otras emociones de esta naturaleza causaban un desbalance en el cuerpo y una pérdida de tonali. Ahí es cuando la enfermedad invadía el cuerpo. Bienvenidos a El virus como metáfora, una discusión en la que se va a abordar el tema de la lógica de lo viral como una herramienta para entender las interconexiones y la interdependencia y la de control en las sociedades contemporáneas. Aunque son muy bien conocidas las trayectorias de nuestros invitados, Ian Buruma es un escritor holandés y editor que ha pues basado en Estados Unidos, ha sido editor del New York Review, es miembro del Consejo de Derechos Humanos en China, así como en el Consejo Europeo de Relaciones Exteriores, y tiene la LUCE Chair in Democracy, Human Rights and Journalism at Bard College en New York. Y bueno, Enrique Krauze ha escrito 20 libros, entre los que ha Estilo de Caudillos, Biografía del Poder, La Presidencia Imperial, y El Pueblo Soy Yo. Ha producido más de 500 programas y documentales sobre la historia de México. Es director de la revista Letras Libres y de la editorial Clio. Pues un honor estar aquí con ustedes. Y pues, we will change to English during this discussion, and I think that it's important that Ian can hear what I just said about the introduction, so I will repeat part of this in English, just the part.
Well, I understood enough that you don't really need to do that.
Perfect, Ian. Thank you. Okay, so I give you the word. We hear you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure. I won't say very much, especially not about metaphors, but I'll say a few things. Academics, like other natural catastrophes, almost invariably invite conspiracy theories. It's well known in European history that whenever there was a plague, this would lead to pogroms against Jews, and Jews were blamed for the plagues, for spreading diseases, for killing children, and so on and so forth. A more recent example of the same phenomenon happened in 1923, when there was a devastating earthquake in Tokyo, in Japan. And a rumor immediately went round the city, stoked by certain people, deliberately, of course, that the Koreans had deliberately poisoned the wells and were killing native Japanese, the Koreans being an unpopular minority, and that somehow they were responsible for the large numbers of deaths that were in fact the result of an earthquake and a terrible firestorm. Now, the question is, why do natural catastrophes, including epidemics, invite conspiracy theories? Well, certain things, I suppose, are too obvious to dwell on for very long. One is that natural catastrophes are mysterious, and certainly were. It suddenly happens. It comes out of nowhere. It's not always adequately explained. As in the case of the COVID epidemic, we didn't really know what started it. There were many theories. we know that it probably started in China, but that's about all we knew. And for the lack of an explanation, people then look for a simple one. And a simple explanation usually means that you have to blame it on somebody, preferably an unpopular minority. So it's to fill in the gap, fill in the mystery of sudden horror and catastrophe. It's often, the point is often made that conspiracy theories do especially well under dictatorships, or at least political systems when there are a lot of constraints on free speech. In other words, when people don't have enough information on what's going on, they make things up, simply to have this sense of control over reality that otherwise seems slippery and mysterious and inexplicable. And so you need simple explanations, and the simple explanations very often turn into very complicated explanations, but at least they're explanations that you can say, this is why A or Z or A or B or C happened. People need this, and otherwise they feel at sea. Now, I said that this happens especially under dictatorships when there is a lack of free information. But of course, we know from what happened during the COVID in the United States in particular, but not only in the United States, in other countries too, where conspiracy theories very quickly spread, and even intelligent people who should know better believe in theories that it was started in a lab in Wuhan in China, or other theories which say that it's really started in a lab in Washington, where the US military was doing experiments in bacteriological warfare, and somehow this spread to China and so on. There are also theories that the whole thing is a hoax cooked up by people like Bill Gates or George Soros to somehow dominate the world population. Now, in the United States or in European democracies, and no doubt Mexico, you can't blame this on a dictatorship or a lack of information. In some ways, you could say it's a result of too much information, in that in the age of the internet, when there are a million explanations for everything, ranging from the completely crazy to at least rational propositions, people really don't know what to think or to believe anymore. And so you get, paradoxically, a similar effect to living in a society with no access to clear information at all. So when there are a million explanations, all kinds of craziness will be believed by people for one reason or another. Now, one of the more disturbing factors is how tenacious some of the theories, the conspiracy theories, are, how similar things keep returning. One of them is that on many, many websites, magazines, and other places, those who propose that the COVID epidemic was a hoax, a conspiracy concocted by people like George Soros and Bill Gates or others, the people who believe that also often have theories about 9/11, and that somehow that was a Zionist plot. And the role of the Jews, which in COVID surely should be nil, somehow comes back in these theories over and over again. And again, the question then is why? I mean, some of the theories about American conspiracies are fed by the Russians to cause mischief in popular opinion in the West. We know that. But why are the Jews so often blamed, and have so often been blamed throughout history for these calamities? I think one of the reasons is that traditionally anti-Semitism, so in the days of the plagues, anti-Semitism was a question of religion, that the Jews were the religious enemy. They'd killed Jesus Christ and so on. And they were very visible and often living in remote communities. From the 19th century onwards, the late 19th century onwards, of course, this changed when in many countries Jews got civil rights, became more successful, and were harder to recognize. And then I think this led to a kind of biological form of racism, which means that the Jews, like a virus, where it became invisible, and therefore anti-Semitism took a different shape, in that, like a virus, the Jews were sort of an invisible enemy that were present amongst us and could not be seen with the naked eye, but were there nonetheless, and were very powerful in creating disasters among us. And it's not for nothing that the Nazis used biological terminology in their efforts to exterminate this problem, which was often likened to exterminating a noxious virus or a bacteria. Now, I'll conclude these remarks with another question, which is why often quite intelligent and even learned people believe in these conspiracies, in these theories, which, if you examine them closely, are completely insane often. And I think the reason is that with these theories, as is true of a lot of extreme politics, a lot of people are drawn to them who feel normally unseen or unrecognized, or not sufficiently unrecognized. The second-rate academic, the journalist who isn't published as much as he would want in publications that he would like to. The failed novelist, and so on. And they tend to latch onto these theories also because, and here again there's a religious precedent, because it gives you a sense of power and satisfaction that you are part of a small minority of chosen ones who've seen reality, who've seen the light, whereas the rest of the world is still fast asleep or corrupted. And this has always been the case. It's always this phenomenon has always been there. But again, because of the internet, a great change is taking place. In the past, such people could form small groups of disgruntled figures who, if they were lucky, could send a letter to the editor of a newspaper, and if they were not too crazy, get them published. Now, their thoughts and ideas can be spread to millions in a few seconds. And they go, as the expression is, they can go viral. And so theories about the virus have become like viruses themselves, except that in many ways they are much more dangerous. And that concludes my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that it's especially interesting. I'd like to discuss a little bit later about the mystery of around catastrophe. No, maybe that's something that is related, with coping with this anxiety about the extinction of life, the mysterious of catastrophes, etc. Thank you very much, Ian. Enrique, can you share with us?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be in this panel with my friend Ian, Buruma, and with you, Paloma, and with FIL. Very thankful. My subject today is I would like to raise the problem of historical awareness of the pandemic. The COVID pandemic makes us think back and rethink. Why did the 1918 pandemic of influenza, of Spanish flu, didn't leave a lasting mark? Why didn't it produce a kind of permanent global alert? A more widespread consciousness of the importance of science in our lives. Maybe it was the effect of the Second World War, a catastrophe that overshadowed it, but still, there were 500 million people infected, the third of the world's population, and 50 million people died. So we should have learned. Why didn't we? Why did we think that plagues happened only long ago, in biblical times, in medieval Europe, or in the 16th and 17th century? It was Ingmar Bergman who said once, In medieval times, men were afraid of the plague. In modern times, men are afraid of the atomic bomb. But the atomic bomb didn't happen after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And here we are, as in biblical times, as in medieval Europe, the problem is the plague. And this problem of historical awareness has also something disturbing in Mexico. Because we had several epidemics, and Paloma mentioned it wisely, measles, and also it was called in Mexico Cocolitzli. Around 15 million people died in the 16th century. Why did we forget that? Yes, of course, there were immense achievements in the 20th century to eradicate epidemics. And Mexico was not an exception. Generations of doctors and serious research did wonders for Mexicans' health during the second half of the 20th century. But somehow, I think the public took it for granted and thought of it as an accident in history. Yes, I know. We can point out some outstanding works of art and literature. Garcia Marquez's novel, Love in the Times of Cholera, The Plague by Albert Camus, and Bergman's The Seventh Seal. I'm sure there are many more. But nothing in art or literature, I think, or in history, in historical consciousness, approached vaguely the great themes and obsessions of the 20th century, which were, of course, the wars, the Second World War, the Cold War, etc. Even the word pandemia, something new and unheard that caught us by surprise, although there were a few prophets. So my point is, there was a kind of blind spot in our historical awareness. And it's a mystery for me. That brings me to the next question. How will this pandemic will be remembered? I hope it will be remembered that it will be remembered. That's the first thing. As a terrible tragedy that it is. An ongoing tragedy, by the way, because we truly don't know when, how, or it will end, or if it will end. But when it comes to it, I hope its outcome can lead to a great leap in our respect of science and the prestige of science in a time when even the value of science has been put in doubt by populist politicians. Second, I hope that it can also lead in a growing consciousness of the need to enhance global efforts to tackle climate change. And third, I hope it will also make possible a much more rapid, effective global cooperation. So to sum up, for me, it's a mystery. I don't understand why such an immense tragedy for humankind that happened 100 years ago left in the public conscience of at least of the Western world, such weak imprint. And that brings me to what I would like to ask my friend Ian, which is this. You lived for many years in the Far East. You were an editor there, and you've written books about it, about that experience, memoirs of that experience. How do you see the difference of the approach between the pandemic in countries like Japan, China, Singapore, Taiwan, Vietnam even, in comparison to America and Europe? And if you see some difference of the approach between those countries, and is there my idea that in the West we simply forgot that immense tragedy of 100 years ago? Am I also talking about the East, or did they somehow manage to remember?
Would you like me to answer?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, in some ways, it was remembered more there, because one of the reasons, there may be other reasons, but one of the reasons I think that in Japan and in Korea, South Korea, China, they've been more successful in containing corona is that they wear masks. And this is not an ancient tradition. The Japanese began to wear face masks when they had colds to stop spreading their cold to other people on public transport and so on. Since 1918, it's a legacy of the flu epidemic. And so it did leave a certain memory in some places. I suppose the other reason is that there is in some countries, a greater trust in the authorities. In some countries, perhaps also more inclination to social conformity, that it's easier to get people to conform to certain rules like wearing masks or keeping their distance or other necessary measures than in countries where people tend not to follow rules or the authorities. But again, one should be very careful with these great sweeping comparisons between East and West, because there are great differences inside the Western world. The French government was quite strict about imposing lockdowns and that kind of thing, compared to, say, the Dutch government, where they made a deliberate decision, and the government said this, that they wouldn't make it mandatory to wear masks, but they would leave it up to the individual responsibility of the individual citizen who was an adult and could be trusted to act responsibly. Well, people didn't act responsibly, with the results that we can read about in the newspapers. But actually, you cannot say that it's worse in, say, the Netherlands than it is in France. So again, these explanations only go so far. But I think to answer your question, clearly wearing masks has been enormously important, and it was a legacy of 1918 in East Asia.
I would like to ask you a question both about relationship between this take and the information, because Ian talked about how today the information that we have too much information, right? About what it is the illness, how to treat it, all the misleading news about the situation. And at the same time, we are talking about the place or epidemics in time, right? We have, during this discussion, medieval plagues, no? The Cocolistli, 16th century, the influenza española, no? Tifo Maria, in 19th century in Mexico, for example. A lot of epidemics. But I want to say, I want to share with you this idea that, okay, when we think in the Cocolistli, for example, in the 16th century, we were in the first years of the printing press, right? To share something, to publish something was extremely difficult, right? and there's so much infrastructure to control information. And right now, in a point in which basically everyone can publish their own information, right? So individual conception of the illness and expression has been like this, it increased in this huge information of the individual experience now, and at the same time, how do you understand the that chaos of information, how the way we are living today, the pandemic?
First of all, there is a difference between the flu epidemic and COVID, in that people knew perfectly well what flu was and how it operated and why people got sick and so on. Whereas even yes, I agree with Enrique that we must hope that people have more confidence in science and in developing science and so on. But even the scientists didn't really have an explanation for COVID, and the symptoms varied so much from person to person that there are huge scientific mysteries. And so it's not, I think the misinformation and the amount of information is not just because of the internet and all the nonsense that is spread that way, but also because there was genuine bafflement amongst the experts.
Concerning information, what I would like to stress, and especially in Mexico, if I may say, is that as a historian, I can tell you, even though I know there are people that have been specialized in the history of the pandemics, even from pre-Hispanic times, those were like niches in the academia and were almost unknown by the wider audiences. It's something that would be very important, either for private pursuits and public too, to give us historical awareness of Mexico as a place that has suffered from these diseases since pre-Hispanic times, and also accompany that information, that historic information, with what you, Paloma, said at the beginning, the quite different ethical, theological, medical approaches to this illness. Let's not forget, for instance, just one point, that the greatest poet of Mexico's, maybe of Mexico's colonial times for sure, and one of the greatest poets in Mexican history, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, died from attending people that were infected by an epidemic. So we need to bring this to the. We're living with that as we speak, and we'll be living with that for many months. I hope only months, not years. But we shouldn't forget. That would be my main point. And let me stress again, and particularly in Mexico, because I have no voice, no way to convey this message to the United States, but in Mexico, yes, science and more science. It is a crime what has been done officially by the government to not to only to the institutions of scientific research in medicine and other fields, but it is a crime what has been done to science and to the prestige and the place of science in the 21st century.
Indeed, in many ways. Ian, I'd like to ask you about the your ideas and analysis, the treatment of guns during the pandemic. because I have read something, a piece of work that you wrote about it, and I think that is very interesting that maybe we can say about how during the COVID-19 epidemic, the stores that sell the guns in the States wanted to have this possibility to be considered as first necessity.
Well, one of the paradoxes, grotesque paradoxes, is that the same people who will run to the gun shops are also people who are likely not to want to wear a mask and imitate their president, because they see it as a form of individual liberty not to have to wear a mask, and by the same token see it as a sign of their individual liberty that they can go around with guns. Once again, I think it has something to do with attitudes to authority, in that the United States is as far as I know, and Enrique, as an historian, may be able to correct me here, but as far as I know, the United States is the only liberal democracy where the state has no monopoly on violence. In other words, where individual citizens can arm themselves. And the reason that this started with the right, constitutional right for militias to arm themselves, it doesn't talk about individuals, but militias to arm themselves, was a distrust of the state. It was the idea that a free citizen ought to be able to organize armed resistance against a government that will take away its freedom. And this form of paranoia never went away. And so the same people who have a deep distrust of the federal government and a warped idea of individual liberty will run to the gun shops as soon as they feel unprotected. And the virus gave rise to such fears, and they didn't feel that they were afraid that it would lead to mass violence and so on. And the only way to protect yourself is to buy a gun.
Paloma, and I would like to point out a bit more about the importance of information. Information not about the medical aspects or the health aspects that are at stake here, but of the lasting consequences that we can only now foresee, but we need information of that, and we are lacking information. For instance, the way we work, how this pandemic is changing, and in which ways will it change lastingly or not the way we work in the office. It depends on different companies, of course, industry, service companies, commerce, but that's something that we need to be to discuss, to be more informed, and to debate. Maybe the key word here is debate. What we are needing in television, in radio, is, I'm talking here about Mexico, which is what concerns me, is debate. We need to debate all these things. We need to debate how it will affect the way we learn. Decades ago, we've been talking about universities. Are the universities remains of the past? The size of the universities, the need to attend personally classes, even the doubtful usefulness of the personal attendance for knowledge and creativity. What will COVID do to universities and to schools? The way we work, the way we learn, the way we relate, that's another immense point. Of course, there are all sorts of pieces and essays coming out everywhere on these subjects, but I would like in Mexico to have debates on this on these subjects, not to mention, of course, the effects on the economy. And something not for the experts, but more for the poets and the writers. The way we live and the way we die, the way we think of life and death. This it might lead to a kind of philosophical reassessment of Stoicism in life. I hope that we're going to see in the future, in the near future, many blooming of novels and essays and poems to rebuke, for instance, the myth of infinite progress. I mean, these are aspects of the pandemic that need to be tackled in public debates. And unfortunately, due to the polarization that we live in Mexico as elsewhere, but very acutely in Mexico, there is no such thing as public debate on these subjects. And the most important subject of all, the situation of Mexican health, because we are, as we speak, already have 1 million people infected and 100,000 people that have died from COVID. So this is a call for public debate on these subjects.
At this point, we have discussed about fear and violence and how the situation of the COVID make harder the social relationships, and we have talked about history as memory also, and the historical awareness as a way to cope with the anxiety and all the things that we don't know how we're gonna live it. But I want to ask you to conclude. How do you think is a very tricky question, I know, but how do you think that the world is going to be after this pandemic?
Well, let me tell what I would like to think about the future is this. A few months ago, I spoke with a friend of ours, of Ian and I, Leon Wieseltier, who told me that he was reading a book in Hebrew, and the title of that book in Hebrew was Olam Hafush. My Hebrew is almost nil, but I know that the translation is The World Upside Down. And it was written by one Dr. Rabbi Abraham Catalano in Padua during the bubonic plague of 1632. Luckily, there was an English translation, so I got hold of that. And it was very moving and very important experience for me to read that chronicle of that man who lost his wife and a child, and he kept a diary of everything that happened inside and outside the ghetto. And exceptionally, in the history that Ian was pointing of the Jews being blamed for the plague, in Padua in 1632 they were not blamed, but there was a wonderful cooperation between the authorities in Venice and the Jewish population in Padua. And they helped each other. And it was a detailed account of what happened there, how they helped one another, how they established a lazaretto, a little hospital, and all the social distancing that they had to do, and they obeyed the social distancing, and how they wear those kinds of masks and everything. And what was more moving is that this man, Abraham Catalano, tells us the very terrible, heartbreaking, and some also inspiring stories of life and death of the people that died and the people that saved people. It is a lesson of humanity. So for me, it was very important as a historian to read that Jewish chronicle and it was very inspiring because it meant cooperation, the respect for science at that time, for medicine, and the respect of human lives. And in that sense, it's very painful to contrast that chronicle, which tell the story of hundreds of people, to the terrible mark of 100,000 people that are dead in Mexico, and that there are only a number. They're not people, they're a number. And our authorities remained silent, irresponsibly handling this immense tragedy that is happening now as we speak.
Well, I don't know what the world is going to be like. I don't know what the world's going to be like next year, let alone in the future. But I think one of the big problems facing the democratic world is a lack of trust in our democratic institutions. I think that's one of the biggest threats facing us. And the virus has complicated that threat. There isn't an easy answer to be derived from it. But on the one hand, it's clear that the alternative superpower to the United States, which is China, is using their apparent success in controlling the virus as a kind of advertisement for authoritarian government. And the idea is we can take decisions, we can make our citizens obey the rules, we're more efficient, and look at these messy democracies where everything is running out of control. And this shows that an authoritarian capitalist system is better than a liberal democratic one. That's one, in a way, threat to our trust in Western, well, let's not say Western, in liberal democratic institutions. The other one is internal, that a system that's already under pressure, whereas the trust in authority, in democratically elected authorities is already low. Many democratic governments are clearly making a hash of it, which strengthens the Chinese argument. On the other hand, I couldn't be too categorical about this either, because one of the surprises of the US election that just took place is that you would have thought Trump, who's probably made a bigger mess of the corona crisis than any other government in the world, authoritarian or democratic, did get voted out, but only just. And one would have thought that the coronavirus and his handling of the coronavirus would have created the conditions for a democratic, a huge democratic landslide victory. It didn't. It seems to have had very little impact on the voters. And those who voted for Trump or against did not really mention, some of them did, but most of them did not really mention COVID as the main reason either for or against. So that rather contradicts the argument I was trying to make, but I still think that is the greatest threat at the moment. And I think in one way or another, the way the virus is handled will have an effect on it.
Well, we are really at the end for this great discussion. I will ask you for a final conclusion of thinking about the virus as a metaphor, something that you want to share with us?
Well, before being a metaphor, the virus is a virus. The pandemic is a pandemic. What we need is information. What we need is science. What we need is responsibility. What we need is public debate. We are lacking those four crucial elements in today's Mexico. It seems to me that the United States is heading, we don't know, but it's heading towards a new government, a new administration. I hope, because I want to end with a more positive message. I want to think that the importance that still the United States have in the world stage and the example of the new administration by Biden and Harris will truly help us. First of all, help us south of the border.
Well, I have no great conclusions. I'd like to thank you again for inviting me. And I can only say, subscribe to what Enrique says, that yes, we have to leave it with an expression of hope, because without hope, we're doomed. Most hopes will end up in disappointment, but we have to keep on hoping nonetheless. That's what it is to be human.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Muchísimas gracias. Ha sido una discusión sumamente interesante, muy rica. Se han abordado temas que tienen que ver con la necesidad del debate público, del fomento a la investigación científica, ¿no? Para poder encarar las condiciones que nos trae la pandemia. También hemos discutido sobre la memoria histórica, sobre el efecto en la violencia y el miedo, pues la vulneración, ¿no? De las comunidades marginadas en las distintas sociedades, donde la plaga, las enfermedades, las epidemias, pues han afectado. Muchísimas gracias. Los invitamos a que continúen con el programa de la feria. Sigue la mesa Nuevas Comunidades con Vaz Curi, Benvenuto y Moreno. Y muchísimas gracias por haber estado con nosotros en esta mesa, El virus como metáfora, con Buruma y Enrique Krauze. Hasta la siguiente.
Can I say one more thing? I just hope we can all see each other. One more. I hope we can see each other in Guadalajara next year.
I'm sure we will.
Next year in Guadalajara. I've heard that somewhere.
Next year in Guadalajara.